Yellow. Today we're talking memory 2. Mm, why a second module in memory? It's because it's complicated. So here's the lecture outline. We're going to start by talking about this difference between the systems view and the processing view of memory. Then I will jump into really explaining the processing view, starting with encoding, which is about making meaning, retrieval, which is really about matching the conditions at encoding, and then storage, which usually comes in between these, but I'm treating it as neuroscience. We're covering that kind of at the end, and then wrapping it all up with the constructive nature of memory. Before we get too far, I want us to read together this short excerpt, this little short story called The Escaped Convict. The man walked carefully through the forest. Several times he looked over his shoulder and scrutinized the woods behind him. He trod carefully, trying to avoid snapping twigs and small branches that lay in his path, for he did not want to create excess noise. The chirping of the birds in the trees almost annoyed him, their loud calls serving to distract him. He did not want to confuse those sounds with the type he was listening for. All right, don't do anything with that right now. I will come back to it and ask you about it a little bit later. But first, let's start unpacking this idea of the processing view versus the systems view. I mentioned it last lecture, but I want to come back to it and let it help us introduce the concept of the system or the processing view. So the systems view of memory is really concerned with identifying these distinct memory stores and then specifying the structural properties of each store, like the capacity, the duration, or the coding format. But the idea here is really like, what are the different kinds of memory that we have? So this area of memory research emphasizes the different kinds of memory, their unique characteristics related to information type, capacity, and duration. The processing view of memory, in contrast, is less concerned with identifying these separate memory processes and more concerned with how information is processed, and really very much focused on these three complementary processes: encoding, storage, and retrieval. So this is the analogy that this is first of all the visual analogy that I came up with. I was like trying to figure out literally like how could I visually represent this idea other than actually using the model views themselves. And this is the metaphor that I'm using, is that the systems view was really concerned with identifying like the types of memory. Here I'm thinking about this in terms of like the type of food. Is it fresh? Is it leftovers? Is it uncooked? Is it raw? Like that's kind of how the memory systems view works. The memory processing view is much more concerned with like how information is being processed. So instead of thinking about like, is this raw or is this cooked or is this leftovers, think about like, how is it cooked and how does it taste? So, and I also really wanted to sort of give you a very concrete example using short-term memory. So using the systems view, short-term memory is a separate memory system. It's a separate container that temporarily holds information that we're consciously aware of. And it has a limited capacity of between, 4 to 7 items or chunks, whatever that means. And it has a really brief duration, 15 to 20 seconds, or sorry, 15 to 30 seconds if you're being prevented from rehearsing it. The information tends to be encoded either in a visual or a phonological form, and short-term memory functions as this temporary buffer and a gateway to long-term memory. The processing view of memory, thinking about short-term memory, is that rather than treating short-term memory as this distinct structural system, this view treats short-term memory retention as the result of ongoing cognitive activity. So information remains in conscious awareness only as long as it continues to be processed. If processing is shallow based on visual or phonological features, the information is likely to fade quickly. If processing is deep and semantic, then information is more likely to be encoded into long-term memory. Capacity limits really reflect attentional limits rather than the boundaries of a structural memory store. So you can see these very distinct ways of thinking about memory. And we're really going to talk about this processing view, looking at how information is being processed and how that determines how long it will be retained. This is the time for you to go do the H5P. You should now be able to complete the H5P view, or sorry, the H5V, the systems view versus the processing view of memory. All right, so let's jump into the first major process that we like looking at, which is encoding, the major gist of which is making meaning. How do you get information into long-term memory? You make it meaningful. So you're going to see examples of a few different strategies that fit this theme in this section on encoding. And this is how you get information into long-term memories. You make it meaningful. Here's the first one. Let's put this into use. People remember information they generate better than information they just hear or read. What do you think this effect is called? I'm literally trying to make you use it by getting you to generate the title. We're also looking at a bunch of wind turbines which generate electricity. If you guessed the generation effect, you are correct, my friend. No trick questions here. So the other thing, another strategy for encoding is that people can store information in multiple forms, including a verbal code as well as a mental image code. So this is when you hear or read information, generating images helps you to recall that information because you end up using two different codes, two different ways of accessing that information, two different kinds of cues for recall. And this is referred to as the dual coding effect. We will come back to this when we talk about imagery. So related to this is the idea that the more bizarre those images, the better. So this is sometimes referred to as bizarre imagery, but it's actually a combination of the dual coding effect and the von Restorff effect. Items that are distinctive are recalled better. That's obviously going to be true with bizarre imagery, right? So that is, bizarre imagery is distinctive. It will be recalled better. But the von Restorff effect is not just about these sort of high level versions of distinctiveness. You can see von Restorff effect in very simple cases. This is an example of the von Restorff effect. If I break this out and treat this sentence as if it's a list, you're going to remember the word example better than any of the other words because here it's written in bold and red compared to all of the other unbolded and black letters. For the next effect, I'm going to tell you about an experiment by Rogers et al. They had participants rate words for different characteristics. So either a structural rating based on whether or not the word was a long word or a short word, the phonemic characteristics, so whether it was rhythmic or lyrical sounding, semantics, whether or not the word was meaningful to you, or self-referential. So did this word actually describe you? And then after this rating experiment, they gave the participants a surprise recall test. And here are the words that they could recall. So based on average recall is a function of the different conditions or the different kinds of ratings that participants did. Here you can see that of the 4 different kinds of ratings, those words that were rated for how much they referred to you as a person for the participants had a significant advantage. So this is referred to as the self-referential effect. People recall information better when it's related back to the self during encoding. I remember doing this when I was in undergrad and taking clinical psych and trying to memorize all of the different mental disorders. I was like diagnosing all of my friends and family because like that was just sort of an easy way to remember these mental disorders. Not that I actually really thought people had many of them, although some. This one is this is huge if you're in a different class because it turns out that performance on a memory test can really be enhanced by being tested on the material to be remembered. Your textbooks often have these test yourself sections, and I remember when I was an undergrad, I would look at those pages and be like, sweet, one page of reading I don't have to do. But those are actually really useful sections. So I actually think it's helpful to start with those test yourself sections in order to help direct your studying habits. But this research is actually fairly new, the testing effect. So this experiment had two phases. We have the learning phase and then a week later, the test phase. So first, let me unpack the learning phase. Participants in this experiment were asked to learn 40 Swahili word pairs. Now, FYI, the reason why they used Swahili word pairs is they consulted with their linguistics department and asked them for advice about what language to use because they wanted word pairs from a language that would be unfamiliar to the vast majority of participants, but that would be easily pronounceable. And the linguistics department said, you're looking for Swahili. So 40 Swahili word pairs. And in the first condition, so participants randomly assigned to one of four conditions. In the keep all condition, participants would do the first round of study including all 40 items, and then a round of testing with all 40 items. They would then go through a subsequent 2 more rounds of study and test, keeping all of the items for every iteration. In the drop from study condition, participants would be studying all of the items on the first round, but they would drop any items that they got correct from the study phase. However, they would keep them in the subsequent test phases. In the drop from test condition, participants would study all of the items and then be tested on all of the items through the first cycle of learning, then drop any items from the test, but keep all of those items in the study component. In the drop from both, participants, anything that they got right in a test condition would be dropped from both the subsequent study and test sections. So a week later, participants were brought back into the lab and tested on their ability to recall those 40 Swahili word pairs. And here are the results. So we're looking at the proportion recalled as a function of those 4 different learning conditions. And this is a kind of a remarkable result here. So first of all, you want to take note that we're looking at about 80% accuracy for the conditions where all of the items were tested repetitively, compared to about 30 to 35% accuracy from the conditions where those items were dropped from test. So what the researchers discovered here is that the key was really about testing, not about studying. So this was interesting because I think that the assumption is that learning happens exclusively during study periods and that tests are these sort of neutral assessments of knowledge. But it looks as if there's actually a lot of learning that's happening during testing. So tests are not merely neutral assessments of knowledge. Learning happens during that period. Researchers have described 2 forms of rehearsal, maintenance and elaborative rehearsal, and these are very influential ways of thinking about how memory is processed, especially when we're talking about encoding. Maintenance and elaborative. Maintenance rehearsal involves repetition without considering meaning or trying to make connections to other information. And it's useful for maintaining information in the short term, but it's unlikely to result in that information being transferred into long-term memory. Conversely, elaborative rehearsal involves creating connections between new material and information you already know and is much more effective for getting information into long-term memory. This finding was known already, but Craig and Lockhart in 1972 used it to propose the levels of theory, the levels of processing theory. According to this theory, memory depends on how information is encoded, with deeper processing resulting in better encoding and retrieval than shallower processing. So to test this, Craig and Lockhart created this levels of processing task. On each trial, participants would receive a question followed by a word that they would need to make a judgment about. And the question indicated the kind of judgment that the participant needed to make. So on the first trial, it would be something like, is the following word in capital letters? Car in lowercase? No. In another kind of trial, they were asked about the phonemics. So, does the following word rhyme with regal? Eagle? Yes. In other trials, they were asked to think about the meaning of the word. So, does the following word complete the sentence? The blank has a silver engine, train? Yes. Craig and Lockhart then essentially operationally characterized each one of these conditions as either shallow or deep processing. So the capitalization question would promote shallow processing, where attention is being really directed to the superficial features of the word, like literally whether it's capitalized or not. In comparison, the fill in the blank question promotes this deeper level of processing, where attention is directed towards the meaning and relating the information to something else. And here are the results. So as you can see, in terms of the percent correct, on a subsequent surprise recall test, participants were the best at recalling any item that they were required to think about semantically through the fill in the blank condition. Rhyming was somewhere in the middle, and then the capital letters performed the worst because participants were processing the information based on these really superficial features. So what is shallow processing and what is deep processing? Well, according to the theory, deep processing leads to better recall during a subsequent surprise memory test. So it's a circular argument here, right? So like deeper processing is defined by its effect, which means we can't know what deep processing is in advance because we have no real operational definition of deep processing. It's all predicated on the outcome of the experiment. So we actually wouldn't know in advance which of these would produce deep processing or shallow processing. We would have to wait for the experiment. And what about rhyming? What does the rhyming condition constitute? Is it shallow? Is it deep? Why? Why does it fall into one or the other? Or why is it somewhere in between? Levels of processing has some problems, including this idea that there were some very circular arguments here. Researchers have essentially worked around this problem, and instead of referring to stimuli as either being deep or shallow in nature, or conditions being deep or shallow in nature, people now operationally kind of define this as semantic processing versus perceptual processing. Semantic processing producing deeper processing that results in better learning, and perceptual processing resulting in shallower processing that results in worse learning. So we've kind of gotten around that, but that is absolutely a huge criticism of the levels of processing theory to begin with. Very early on in memory research, like I want to say like 1910s, researchers recognized that people tend to spontaneously organize information as they recall it. If you give people a big mixed up list of words that come from three different categories, say like suburbs of the lower mainland, snacks, and luxury car brands, if you give it all jumbled up, people tend to recall it actually categorically. So, because the category actually probably serves as a retrieval cue for recalling other items in that category. And what though if you provide categories for organization at the beginning? So you don't provide it mixed up, you actually give it in the categories itself. In the 1960s, Gordon Bauer and his colleagues ran an experiment where they had participants encode lists of words that were organized into tree diagrams like this. For one of the groups, the trees were organized according to categories. They were semantically and hierarchically organized, like we're seeing now. But the other group of participants saw exactly the same list, exactly the same trees, with exactly the same structure, but now the words were randomly organized like this. What they found was that participants who had trees that were organized categorically elicited an average recall of 73 items, while the participants that saw the trees that were randomly arranged only recalled on average about 21 items. That's a huge difference here. And note how this doesn't really conform to um, the capacity of short-term memory, right? Like 73 items is an actually enormous amount of information to remember. So is this short-term memory? Is this long-term memory? Is this episodic memory? Is this semantic memory? The processing view basically says, who cares? How does semantics work? How does the episodic elements work? How does the way you're processing or organizing information impact how long information lasts? So, interestingly, researchers found that when you prevent organization of material, you can actually really hurt encoding, but illustrations can help. This research also suggests that if you prevent organization, you can hurt encoding. Researchers Branford and Johnson came up with a really clever way to test this hypothesis. This is some of my favorite research. So, they presented participants with an ambiguous story. If the balloons popped, the sound would be able to carry since everything would be too far away from the correct floor. The closed window would also prevent the sound from carrying since most buildings tend to be well insulated. Since the whole operation depends on a steady flow of electricity, a break in the middle of the wire would also cause problems. Of course, the fellow could shout, but the human voice is not loud enough to carry that far. An additional problem is that a string could break on the instrument. Then there could be no accompaniment to the message. It is clear that the best situation would involve less distance. Then there would be fewer potential problems, and with face-to-face contact, the least number of things could go wrong. So this is an ambiguous story. It's hard for people to follow what's happening in this story because it's really just sort of unclear what is going on. But Bransford and Johnson created illustrations that help to clarify the ambiguity in their stories. Now, this illustration could be presented before participants heard the story, after the participants saw the story, or it could be presented never to participants. And that's exactly what they did. They wanted to see what the impact of this clarifying image was. And so here we've got participants who never saw the clarifying image. The number of details they could recall from the story was only about, just under 30%. If participants saw the picture beforehand, they were much better, almost twice as good. So almost 60% of the details from the story they could recall. But what do you think happened for the participants who saw the picture after? Do you think that they're going to look more like the participants who never saw the clarifying image? Do you think they'll match the results of the participants who saw the picture before? Or do you think they'll be somewhere in the middle? To get the answer, go do the encoding and making meaning, H5P. There is a little activity in there that actually tells you the answer here, and it's kind of an important answer, so you should definitely go find what that answer is. I think you'll be surprised, actually. All right, let's talk about retrieval, which is matching conditions at encoding. So, when you're encoding information, the context can be encoded along with the to be remembered information. It's like the external details of where you are get swept up into the memory, and the consequence of reinstating that context actually serves as a retrieval cue. This should be actually very familiar to everybody. You're doing the dishes, you're thinking to yourself, oh, I should change my alarm because I have to get up early tomorrow. So you walk into your bedroom and you're standing there going, why am I here? So what do? You go back to the kitchen because that's where you encoded that information that you wanted to go change your alarm. So you go back there, and literally being back in the space becomes a cue for recall. So this is referred to as encoding specificity. The classic experiment that researchers use to demonstrate this in notion of encoding specificity involved trained scuba divers who were randomly assigned into two conditions: study underwater or study on land. And this is, I think, like a list of words kind of experiment. So participants either studied the words underwater or on land, but then they were further subdivided into two groups who were either tested underwater or tested on land. Same with the on land group for study, tested underwater or on land. Looking at the results here, so first of all, for participants who studied underwater, they performed better if they were also tested underwater. For the group that studied on land, they were also better when they when they were tested on land. So matching the conditions, the physical or contextual context of the information being encoded serves as a cue for recall. So literally matching the conditions. This leads me to one of my favorite experiments of all time. In state-dependent learning, the context is internal. It's either psychological or physiological. So information gets encoded along with the psychological or physiological details. So reinstating either one of those contexts can serve as a cue for recall. And researchers, Rickles et al. In 1973 looked at this using cannabis. So, a popular justification for marijuana is that marijuana intoxication provides an altered state of consciousness considered to be pleasurable and beneficial, quote unquote. So Rickles et al. Actually wanted to understand the impact of consuming cannabis on these sort of memory processes. So they did a paired associates task. So nonsense syllables that were paired together. Participants would learn the pair. So myth would be paired with camera. And the nonsense syllable became the cue. The target was the English word. And the test was whether or not participants would be able to anticipate the target word before it appears. So, one learning trial involved participants going through all 9 nonsense word pairs. The question that they were looking at was how many learning trials did it get people to get to criteria on day 1? And then on day 2, how did their cued recall go? So day 1, participants are either smoking marijuana or they're smoking a placebo, and learning the list of criteria, which is that you can go through all 9 pairs without making any errors twice. So how long or how many learning trials did it take people to get to criteria is one question. But then day 2, everything crossed. So smoking marijuana or placebo, you get this cued recall. How are people performing on this? By the way, I wanted to show you this because, again, I think this is one of the funniest studies I've ever seen. This is a legitimate academic peer-reviewed article, and in it, it talks about participants were given a hemostat for holding the roach. This is a roach clip. By the way, that's what a hemostat is. If you don't know what a hemostat is, it's literally a roach clip, apparently. All right, so let's look at the results. What happened on day 1? And what happened on day 2. We're actually going to start with day 2 because day 2 really speaks to the encoding specificity. And so here, when participants were on placebo on day 1 and they had placebo on day 2, so matching conditions, they actually did pretty good. They could recall on average about 7.5 items. When there was a mismatch, placebo day 1, marijuana day 2, people did not as good. Mismatch of marijuana day 1, placebo day 2 does a little bit better here, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And then the last one is marijuana. And so the two conditions where there's matching conditions, either placebo or marijuana, have the best performance. Now, you might suspect that this means you should come to class stoned and then write tests stoned, but please don't do that, because here's what you really need to pay attention to, which is the day 1 learning to criteria. How many learning trials did it take people to get to criteria? For placebo, it was less than six learning trials. For marijuana smokers, it took them a lot longer. And that's also why you're going to see in the marijuana placebo condition, people do slightly better than in the placebo marijuana condition, because when they were smoking marijuana, they got more practice and then they were tested sober, so that was helpful. So I'm not saying smoke weed and then be tested smoking weed, but I am explaining to you why it is when you're watching Stranger Things, you can't quite remember what's happening last week until you get back in the mood. But also, uh, marijuana is really bad for young brains. So wait until you're 25 and then have at her. Another form of state dependent learning is called mood congruency effects. And this refers to the fact that mood can serve as a retrieval cue. That's why I've got this picture of Grumpy Cat up, RIP Grumpy Cat. So literally, if you're grumpy during encoding, it means that you're going to be better at recall if you're grumpy during retrieval. This is why it's so easy to remember all the things that you're mad about at your partner when you're mad at them already. So like, they did this thing today and I'm really annoyed. And they did that thing yesterday and another thing last week. So it's going to be easier to recall those things because you have mood congruency effects. Vice versa, too. It's also going to be the reason why you can't remember a single thing they've done wrong when you're very pleased with them. Okay, last but not least, we're going to look at this very interesting effect of matching retrieval and encoding, which has to do with mental processing. And to investigate, researchers used a LOP style experiment, so levels of processing style experiment, where you've got encoding in two conditions. So in this experiment, participants either encoded using the sentence condition, does this word complete the following sentence? The blank has a silver engine, yes or no, plain yes. Or a rhyming condition, does the following word rhyme with regal, eagle, yes. And then participants, after they did the word judgment task, they were given the surprise recall task. And in the testing phase, it came in two forms. So there was a recognition test where participants were presented with words and asked if they'd seen them before, and then a rhyming test and asked whether a word they'd seen had rhymed with one of the target words. So the word that they were seeing, did this word rhyme with one of the words you'd seen before? So we've got the encoding tasks, sentence versus rhyme. We've got the testing conditions, recall versus rhymes with, and here we've got the proportion of words correctly recalled. So first of all, if we're looking at the recall only, this is basically a reproduction of the levels of processing task, and you can see that the sentence task, where you're asking the participants to think about the semantics, produces better recall. Makes sense. That's what we would predict. But what's interesting is what happens when the test condition is, does this word rhyme with any of the target words that you've seen? Now you actually see an advantage for the rhymes condition of encoding, because with the rhymes condition at test. So literally, if you're matching those conditions, even if it's like the mental processing that you're going through, and you can reproduce that mental processing under testing conditions, it's going to improve retrieval. By the way, this is one of the explanations for the testing effect. If you're testing yourself during encoding, that's a mental process. Searching memory for an answer is a mental process that you're literally going to have to reproduce under testing conditions. So by matching those mental processes, you're taking advantage of matching conditions. This is referred to as transfer appropriate processing, because in this case, essentially what, like, the kind of processing you're using at one end is the same kind of processing that you're using at the other end. This is why I've got like a USB to USB cable here. And the idea here is that information is encoded along with the mental processes that you use to encode that information. So it's not just so much context, it's actually what you're doing with information. But whatever way you slice it, the major theme of the retrieval section is matching conditions. So whether those conditions are external, whether they are internal, like physiological or psychological, whether they are mental processes, reinstating conditions of encoding at retrieval is how you're going to make retrieval better. All right, go do the H5P. There's also a short Moodle quiz in this section, which is not really a quiz, it's just one of the other activities, but like now's the time to do it. Okay, next let's talk about the storage component. And this is where we're focusing on neuroscience because that's really kind of what storage is like long-term neural structural changes that help us to keep information long-term. And these processes are referred to as consolidation and reconsolidation. The story of consolidation actually starts with the functional mechanism. Like, what is the functional mechanism in memory? And in 1949, a Canadian researcher, Donald Hebb, had an idea of what it was. Hebb postulated that experience causes physical changes at the synapse. Neurons that fire together wire together. So, according to Hebb's dual trace hypothesis, you might have a series of neurons that are all interconnected. The idea here is that simultaneous or near simultaneous activation is the first trace. That is what is happening in the short term. That's our experience being represented through reverberating activity in the brain. But uh, over time, where you have simultaneous or near simultaneous activation of neurons, you're going to see structural changes. So, two neurons are going to promote structural changes to ensure that in the future, activity of one is going to produce activity of the future, or activity of the other in the future. So, really ensuring that there are structural changes to connect these long term. To explore how memory solidifies over time, it's actually really helpful to examine what happens to memory when memory is compromised. So we're going to put memories on a timeline looking at past versus future, where the demarcation point is the point at which an injury is acquired. So for example, this is where this would be like HM's surgery when he was 27. And this helps to differentiate memories that were formed before the trauma from memories that were being formed after the trauma. So before memories are referred to as retrograde, and memories being formed since the time of injury are referred to as anterograde. This helps to distinguish the two forms of amnesia that we see in the literature. Anterograde amnesia, which is an inability to form new declarative memories, that's what HM experiences or experienced, and that is also what Clive Wearing experiences. That's the deficit that he has. In comparison, um, uh, retrograde amnesia is the loss of the ability to access memories that were previously available. Now, what you see with the with retrograde memory is that remote memories are going to be preserved. Memories for events that occurred in the very distant past will not be compromised in retrograde amnesia. And you tend to have a gradient of memory loss, with more memory loss being associated with more recent past memories. The graded aspect of amnesia suggests that there's something fragile about recent memories, that they're labile and not yet fully consolidated. Now, a couple of things before I move on. First of all, we don't tend to see retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia separately. If a person has one, they usually experience the other as well. It's just that whatever the deficit that's most prominent, that tends to be how the case is labeled. So HM, for example, is considered to have anterograde amnesia, but He also experienced retrograde memory loss for about the 3 to 4 years prior to his surgery. So his most recent memory pre-surgery was from when he was about 23 or 24, and he had that surgery at 27. Um, and people whose major deficit is retrograde, you might see the anterograde memory deficits resolve within a couple of days. But if it is an organic memory deficit, you're going to always see retrograde and anterograde together. So Hebb used this pattern of memory loss in amnesia patients to inform his idea of consolidation. He recognized that those most recent memories are in this labile state, that they are not yet consolidated, and there's a potential to disrupt or rewrite those memories. And Hebb's second trace is really the trace that supports long-term memory. This process of that trace solidifying over time is referred to as consolidation. And we kind of talk about consolidation at a variety of levels. So we can talk about synaptic consolidation, which is essentially when two neurons become strongly associated. But it happens rapidly over a period of minutes. But we can also see systems level consolidation, which is more gradual. It's the reorganization of circuits within the brain regions, and it really is a much longer time scale, from weeks, months, and potentially even years. So there's no particular set timeline for consolidation. However, what we do see is that during consolidation, memories are labile and subject to disruption. That is, they're liable to be disrupted or to change during this period before consolidation. Researchers at McGill University asked the question of um, how labile is memory, and where are the parameters of that lability? So when does memory essentially become permanent or unchangeable? To test this, they actually trained mice to pair together a tone and a shock. But they then gave the mice anisomycin. Anisomycin is an antibiotic, but its mechanism of action is by preventing protein synthesis. Now, these structural changes, Hebb's second trace, that those connections, those physical connections that get built, are proteins. So we're kind of bags of meat. We're almost entirely protein, including our neurons. Our neurons are made out of protein. The connections between neurons are made out of protein. So if you prevent protein synthesis, you're going to prevent the development of structural changes that can help to maintain long-term memory storage. So the researchers tested this. They tested, or they trained the animals on day one to pair a tone and a shock until the animal learned to fear the tone by itself. They showed perfect learning. Day two, they inject the rat with anisomycin, and day three, they present the tone alone, and the rat still freezes. The anisomycin did nothing there. Okay. It was on day two. It was unrelated to either the encoding phase or the retrieval phase. Doesn't matter. But they did a second condition where on day one, the rats were given anisomycin during the learning. So tone was paired with a shock. And while the rats learned that association on day one, the researchers found that on day three, when the tone alone was presented, the rats did not freeze. They acted as if they had never learned that original association of tone plus shock. Here's the most surprising condition, though. So this is the reactivation condition, where the animal, day one, learns the tone plus shock, shows that fear to the tone alone. Day two, the animal is presented with the tone by itself, and in the act of remembering what that means, the animal freezes. But you can also see that during this reactivation phase on day two, the researchers injected the animal with anisomycin, so protein synthesis prevented. What happens on day three? The animal acts as if it hasn't learned anything. That is shocking, right? Because what that suggests is that if you prevent protein synthesis during encoding, you're not going to get long-term memory. Sure, makes sense. But if you prevent protein synthesis during recall, you can erase memories that previously existed. Huh? Eternal sunshine of the spotless mind, my friends? Targeted memory erasure is absolutely possible. And if you're wondering whether or not researchers and clinicians have started to use this to treat people with traumatic memories and PTSD, the answer is yes. Yes. But here's the story now, right? So during consolidation, memories are labeled and subject to disruption, but it actually turns out that it's not just during consolidation, it's during consolidation and reactivation when you recall that information and when it's being reconsolidated. Every single time that information is in an active state, it is labile and subject to disruption. Early evidence around the disruption of consolidated memory was clinical, but more recent interest has prompted a number of groups to look at this from an experimental perspective. So, in this experiment, participants or researchers had participants come into the lab and work with a very particular researcher on an object naming experiment. So they were presented with items one at a time on screen, and they just literally had to name the item that they saw. So these are the items that they would have seen on day one. After a 24-hour delay, participants were randomly assigned to one of three conditions. So for the second session, they could have been in the context group where they were being tested in the same lab but with a new researcher. The experimenter group where they were tested in a new lab but with the same experimenter. Or the question group where the participants were tested in a different lab with a different researcher, but were asked, can you describe the general procedure of what you did on Monday? So asked just literally to prompt them to recall what happened. Then they were given a new set of objects for this object naming task, followed by a surprise recall test of all of the items from session one. So let's look at these results. So we're looking at the percent of objects recalled for context, experimenter, and then the question condition for two different items recalled. So accurate recall, which is items that are actually from set one, and then intrusions, which are errors where participants erroneously recalled an item that was actually presented in set two. So here you can see that for accurate recall, all three of the groups are actually approximately equal. There was no significant difference in these. But here, looking at context, if you reinstate the context, now participants are going to show a tremendous amount of disruption. So by being in the same context during the original and new learning, it is both necessary and sufficient for incorporating new information into existing episodic memories. That is literally when you reactivate the memory by putting somebody in the same room, in the same context as the original experiment, that information gets reactivated and then it gets combined with the new information that you're being exposed to. So it actually rewrites your memory of the first day. So here's the story. Information in short-term memory or conscious awareness is labile and subject to disruption. Some of it is going to get consolidated into long-term memory. And while it's in long-term memory, it is stable, it is non-changing, and it is theoretically permanent. If that information is reactivated and recalled back into conscious awareness, it becomes once again labile and sensitive to disruption. Once that information leaves conscious awareness, it can take some of the new information that was present during conscious awareness and integrate it into that memory and reconsolidate the memory into long-term information or long-term memory with both the original event along with new information into a essentially revised version of the memory. Every time you recall an event, it becomes reactivated and labile and subject to disruption. That means that probably your favorite memories are the memories that are the least accurate. Isn't that terrible? So here is the kind of idea with the malleability of memory. You have some event that's happened, right? Like you go to a wedding, and then that's your first wedding, so that's all you have. That's the only representation that you have. Then you go to another wedding, and that wedding has a lot in common with the first wedding, but there's some new events that happen. But the first event, the original memory of the wedding gets reactivated along with this new experience of a new wedding. And what gets put back into long-term memory is an integration of the two. And this is how memory is supposed to work. This is how you create schemas. It's how you create categories. It's how you come to some understanding of how the world works. But because we have this malleability in memory, it's also how we see everyday memory errors come up. They often have this format of some original event is encoded, and then subsequently that original event gets reactivated in the context of some new information, and what gets put back is a combination of the two. So false memories follow this framework. Hindsight bias follows this framework. Retroactive and proactive interference follow this framework. And in fact, many of the everyday memory errors that we have show up and look like this particular framework. Last but not least, the constructive nature of memory. What is the purpose of memory? Why do we remember things at all? Let's tackle this root question from a really Darwinian perspective. Much like our kidneys, our eyes, our limbs, memory must have been shaped by eons of evolution, right? It must have some sort of survival value deep in our evolutionary past. And the answer here is about making predictions. The only value of the past is to help us understand the present or make predictions about the future. And it makes sense to remember only those things that have really helped us to solve problems related to survival of the species. So like the location of water and food, signs of predators and potential mates, etc. It would also make sense for us to forget a lot of the rest, since the clutter of indiscriminate remembering would paralyze us. Survival advantage of memory is to really help us make predictions, right? Like think about that social problem solving experiment that we talked about when we were talking about episodic memory. Really, why do we have episodic memory? It's to make predictions about what might happen in the future. So the survival advantage of memory is to help us make predictions based on our past experience. Some situations have arose, some challenges, tasks, or some novel object that we've encountered, and we took the time to figure out the situation and solution, and we should carry that forward with us. But we do not actually need to remember all of the specific details. So, the existing knowledge that we use for predicting what's next is called a schema. And you guys know I love schemas. I literally love schemas so much. So a schema is a framework or a body of knowledge around some topic. This is a graphic representing kind of the idea of a social media schema. This is going to include like all of the concepts, all of the ideas that you have around social media, and probably digital content production is kind of all lumped in there. But it's based on your experiences, and you use it to try to make predictions about the world. FYI, this consolidation and reconsolidation process is how we build schemas, right? Like you go to one wedding, you have a very a vague understanding of weddings. But by the time you've been to 3 or 4, you now have a very solid conceptual understanding of what happens at weddings. It's going to be culturally specific, but so interestingly, if a schema is invoked, our memory of the material shifts to be more consistent with a schema, because recall isn't an exact reproduction. Recall is always an act of reconstruction, partially based on existing knowledge structures, partially based on recall, partially based on expectations and predictions. And this is where that story from earlier comes in, the escaped convict. I want you to pause this video now and write down as many details about the story as you possibly can. I know that most of you won't do this, so I do want you to also just take a second to think and say the words out loud of all of the things that you can remember. The reason why I want you to do this out loud is because you otherwise probably won't notice whether you're making an intrusive error. This story, another ambiguous story, one of my favorite kinds of stimuli from cognitive experiments is ambiguous stories. This ambiguous story, though, is ambiguous because it has 2 different titles that will make sense. And participants who see this story in an experiment are either going to see it with the title The Deer Hunter or The Escaped Convict. But which title they get is going to dictate which schema they will invoke in order to try to remember this information when it's originally exposed. So Hasher and Griffin used these ambiguous stories with these multiple titles in order to look at how schemas influence the recall of information over time. So they had participants read the passage. Then, after a variable delay, participants were given the title as a cue for recall. So either the Deer Hunter or the Escaped Convict, depending on which one they originally saw. Then they were asked to recall as many of the details from the story as they could. Those details were coded by the experimenters, so idea units were identified. Each individual idea unit was identified, followed by coding of whether or not that idea unit was accurate, an error, or whether it represented an intrusion. An intrusion is an error that reflects the title that was given. So the escapee walked carefully through the woods would be an intrusion because no escapee was ever mentioned, and that error is based on the title. So the dependent variable here is how many intrusions as a proportion of the total idea units produced. The proportion here is because each person serves as their own control. If I recall 10 details and the next participant recalls 20 details, it could be that we still only recall 10% of intrusions, right? So like you want a percentage of the total idea units an individual has proposed. So here we're looking at intrusions as a proportion of the total production after a 5-minute delay, a 2-day delay, and a 1-week delay. So here you can see the errors are increasing over time. There are some errors after 5 minutes, but after a week, almost half of the details that are produced have an error in them that reflect the title that was originally given in the experiment. What does the increase in the intrusions over time indicate? It suggests that over time, our memories literally change to be more consistent with the schemas that we have than with the original experience. And this actually implicates something very interesting about people with highly superior autobiographical memory. So people with HSAM, that's what that's called, are people who tend to have these incredibly detailed memories for like every event in their lives, from about the time that they're a toddler to the present time. And it's rare, but it is an experience that some people have. AJ describes her experience in Parker et al., and I'm just going to read this directly so you have a gist of her experience. So I'm 34 years old, and since I was 11, I've had this unbelievable ability to recall my past, but not just recollections. My first memories are of being a toddler in the crib circa 1967. However, I can take a date between 1974 and today and tell you what day it falls on, what I was doing, and if anything of great importance happened. For example, the Challenger explosion happened on Tuesday, January 28th, 1986. I do not look at calendars beforehand, and I don't read 24 years of my journals either. Whenever I see a date flash on television or anywhere else for that matter, I automatically go back to that day and remember where I was, what I was doing, and what day it fell on and on and on and on. It's nonstop, uncontrollable, and totally exhausting. Some people call me a human calculator while others run out of the room in complete fear. But the one reaction I get from everyone who eventually finds out about this gift is total amazement. They start throwing dates out at me to try to stump me. I haven't been stumped yet. Most have called it a gift, but I call it a burden. I run my entire life through my head every day, and it drives me crazy. So it turns out that AJ was an average student, and she had actually impaired performance on tests that involve organizing material, thinking abstractly, or working with concepts. All skills that are actually really important for thinking creatively and thinking critically. So let's go back to the adaptive value of memory. It makes sense to remember only those things that once help solve problems related to survival, and it also makes sense to forget a lot of the rest, since the clutter of indiscriminate remembering would be paralyzing. Forgetting the details can be helpful. It allows us to extract general rules from a series of specific instances. It allows us to generate schemas, and schemas are helpful. They're adaptive. The trade-off is that our memory tends to produce errors, but those kinds of memory errors are about the reconstructive nature of memory. So looking at this abstract reasoning task where you take these two examples, complete examples, in order to try to predict the solution to the third example, AJ would be terrible at, because she has very poor schema production. She's not creating schemas at the expense of details. She's keeping the details at the expense of schemas and thinking abstractly and inductive reasoning and creative thinking. So even though it feels like our memory fails us, it's literally how it's supposed to work. It's just that it evolved for a completely different version of the world. Okay, here's where you can go complete consolidation and reconsolidation. Okay, systems versus processing view. Systems view, super interested in the different kinds of memory with the different characteristics, the types, capacity, duration. The processing view essentially flips it. Like, who cares what kinds of memory, what kinds of processes are we using, and how does that dictate the capacity and duration? All right, so here are the learning outcomes. These are listed in the module. I will allow you to review these on your own, and have a great week, everybody. Take care.